Welcome to Blackman Folktales. Kindly subscribe to our YouTube channel. And don't forget to like and subscribe. How love found a way back to her. Wooden Town was the kind of place where time seemed to move slower, where every dawn began with the sound of roosters crowing and ended with the glow of lanterns flickering in homes made of mud and bamboo. Life was harsh, opportunities scarce, and dreams often died before they had the chance to grow. Yet in this forgotten town lived a girl whose presence seemed too radiant for the dusty roads and crumbling huts around her. Her name was Debora. She was not only beautiful in the way that made men stare and women whisper, but her beauty seemed woven with intelligence, humility, and a silent strength that no one could ignore. Her eyes carried both fire and tenderness, her smile brought light to those around her, and her mind was sharper than the blade of a hunter's knife. Raised by her widowed mother, she had known poverty all her life. Her father had died when she was just a child, leaving behind debts, unfulfilled promises, and a grieving wife who worked her fingers to the bone just to keep them alive. Despite all this, Debora was determined that her life would not be swallowed by the hopelessness that consumed so many in her village. Every night, while other children ran around barefoot under the moonlight, she sat in their small mud hut, hunched over books borrowed from her school teacher, reading by the dim flicker of a kerosene lamp that often filled the room with choking smoke. Her mother would watch her with both pride and fear, whispering prayers that the girl's brilliance would one day carry her far beyond the walls of Wooden Town. The day her name was announced as the recipient of a scholarship to study abroad, Wooden Town came alive in a way it hadn't in years. Villagers crowded into the square, clapping and cheering as though Debora's victory was their own. Old women ululated, children ran around singing her name, and men patted her on the back, proud that one of their own had broken the chains of limitation. For Debora, it was a day of both triumph and tears. She had always dreamed of leaving the village, of seeing the world beyond the red earth and cracked roads, but the thought of leaving her mother alone gnawed at her heart. Her mother, though, pushed her gently, assuring her that destiny was calling and she must answer. "Go, my child," she had said with trembling hands on Debora's cheeks. "Go and chase the life I could never give you. Do not worry about me, for God will keep me." Those words gave Debora courage, but they also planted a seed of guilt that she carried silently. On the morning she left, with a small wooden box carrying her clothes and a heart full of dreams, the entire town escorted her to the bus that would take her to the city airport. As the vehicle pulled away, she pressed her face against the dusty window and watched her mother's figure grow smaller and smaller until it disappeared completely. Tears streamed down her cheeks, not just for what she was leaving behind, but for the weight of expectations resting on her shoulders. Everyone believed in her now. Everyone prayed for her success. But no one could see the fear that churned inside her, that maybe, just maybe, the world outside Wooden Town would swallow her whole. Life abroad was nothing like Debora had imagined. The towering buildings, the fast-moving cars, the endless noise of cities, it was overwhelming at first. She felt like a small fish dropped into an ocean where the current threatened to drown her. But Debora was not one to surrender. She threw herself into her studies, impressing her professors with her brilliance and resilience. Slowly, she adjusted, making friends from different cultures, learning new ways of life, and building confidence in a world that once terrified her. Yet, even in her brightest moments, the memory of Wooden Town lingered like a shadow, the cracked hands of her mother, the struggles they had endured, the villagers who looked to her as their pride. It was during this time of adjustment that fate brought Brian into her life. She met him in the university library, of all places, when she dropped her books and he bent down to help her pick them up. He was handsome, tall, with a disarming smile and an elegance that marked him as someone born into wealth. What she did not know at that moment was that he was the son of a powerful senator, a man used to privilege, admiration, and influence. But what drew her to Brian was not his status, it was the way he looked at her, not as a poor girl from a forgotten village, but as an equal. Their friendship began with small conversations, sharing books, discussing studies, but soon grew into late-night talks, shared meals, and laughter that carried into the early hours of the morning. For the first time in her life, Debora felt what it was like to be seen, cherished, and loved. In Brian's eyes, she was not a poor village girl, she was a queen. What she did not realize, however, was that this love, pure and bright, would soon be tested by forces greater than either of them could control. Debora's new life abroad seemed like something from a dream. Every corner of the city carried a kind of life she had never experienced before: the dazzling street lights that burned brighter than the brightest moon in Woodland Town, the constant hum of moving cars, and the towering glass buildings that seemed to touch the sky. At first, she felt small, like a stranger wandering through a world that was never meant for her. She missed the quiet of the village, the sound of birds at dawn, and her mother's voice calling her name at sunset. Yet, amidst the noise and chaos, Debora found comfort in her studies. She became known as the intelligent girl who always had answers, the one who stayed late in the library, tirelessly working through textbooks that challenged even the brightest of minds. And it was in this sanctuary of knowledge that she met Brian. Their meeting was ordinary, yet fate disguised miracles in the simplest moments. Her books had slipped from her arms, scattering across the marble floor, and before she could bend to pick them, a young man with gentle eyes knelt beside her. Their hands touched as they reached for the same book, and for a fleeting second, Debora felt something unexplainable, like the air between them had shifted. Brian smiled, and it wasn't just any smile, it was warm, disarming, and genuine. That single smile was the spark that lit the fire of a love story she never saw coming. Brian was unlike anyone Debora had ever known. He was handsome, with sharp features and an elegance that spoke of privilege, but there was a humility about him that made him different from the arrogant young men she often saw on campus. What Debora didn't know at first was that he was the only son of a powerful senator, a man of influence whose name opened doors in the city. Brian never boasted about it. In fact, he often hid behind the simplicity of being just another student. To Debora, he was not a senator's son, he was simply Brian, the young man who brought her coffee when she studied late, the one who listened to her talk about her village with curiosity, the one who looked at her as though she were the only person in the world. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and their bond grew deeper. They shared secrets, dreams, and fears. He told her about his struggle to find his own path outside his father's shadow, while she shared the pain of growing up in poverty and losing her father at a young age. Slowly, Brian became her home in a land far away from everything she knew. Their love was passionate and consuming, the kind that kept them awake through the night, whispering promises of forever. For Debora, who had always fought to survive, it felt like she had finally found the one thing she never thought she deserved: happiness. But happiness, as Debora would come to learn, was often fragile, and destiny had a way of testing hearts at their brightest. 3 months into their romance, when Debora thought her life had finally taken shape, tragedy knocked on her door. Late one evening, as she was preparing notes for a lecture, she received a call that shattered her world. It was from her village. The voice on the other end trembled as it told her that her mother was gravely ill. Debora's heart sank. She knew she had to go back, no matter what it cost. But fear gripped her, fear of losing her mother, fear of losing the scholarship if she left without explanation, and fear of telling Brian the truth. How could she explain to him that her world was collapsing, that the poverty she had left behind was calling her back? In the end, she made a decision that would change her life forever. She left without telling him. With tears in her eyes and a heavy heart, she packed her bags and boarded a plane home. She thought she was protecting him, sparing him the burden of her pain. But what she did not realize was that her silence would create a wound that would take 16 years to heal. When Debora arrived back in Woodland Town, the air seemed heavier, as though the village itself was grieving. Her once energetic mother now lay weak and frail on a bamboo bed, her breath shallow and her eyes sunken. The sight of her mother in such a condition shattered Debora's heart into pieces. She had left Woodland Town filled with hope, with dreams of creating a better life for both of them, but now, staring at her mother's condition, she realized how powerless she truly was. For weeks, she did everything she could, selling what little they had, seeking herbal remedies, begging neighbors for help, but nothing seemed to stop the slow march of death. 2 months later, she found herself kneeling on the cold floor of their hut, her mother's lifeless body in her arms. The wails that left her lips that night echoed through the village, a sound so raw that even the strongest men turned their heads in sorrow. Her world had ended. She was now completely alone. She wanted to reach out to Brian, to tell him everything, but poverty had stolen even that from her. With no phone, no money, and no connection to the outside world, Brian became a distant memory she could not touch. 5 months after her return, when grief was still a fresh wound, Debora's life was shaken again, this time by a revelation that brought both fear and hope. She discovered she was pregnant. At first, panic consumed her. How could she, a poor girl with no family left, raise a child? How could she bear the weight of motherhood when she could barely feed herself? But as her belly grew, so did her resolve. She named the child in her womb Destiny, believing that perhaps his existence was God's way of telling her that her life was not over. Destiny became her strength, the reason she woke up each morning to face another day. The pregnancy was hard, marked by hunger, exhaustion, and whispered gossip from villagers who judged her for coming home unmarried and with child. Yet, Debora endured it all. 4 months later, she delivered a baby boy whose cry filled the air with both pain and promise. As she held him in her arms, she wept, not from regret, but from a fierce love that she never knew she could feel. She swore to protect him, to raise him with the values she cherished, even if it meant giving up her own dreams. Years turned into a blur of sacrifice. Debora worked tirelessly, doing odd jobs in the village to feed her son. She carried loads on her back, fetched water for wealthier families, and even worked as a cleaner in town. Every coin she earned went into keeping Destiny alive and giving him an education. He grew into a bright, hard-working boy who reminded her so much of Brian, the same sharp mind, the same determined eyes, the same charisma. Each time she looked at him, she was reminded of the love she once had and the future that had slipped away from her hands. 16 years passed, and though she carried the weight of loneliness, she never stopped believing that life had more in store for them. When Destiny became a teenager, she decided it was time to try again. They traveled abroad, clinging to the hope that a better future awaited them. But fate was cruel. Without money or connections, mother and son ended up sleeping under bridges, shivering through nights filled with hunger and despair. Still, Debora never let Destiny see her break. She whispered to him in the dark, "One day, all this will change. One day, your name will open doors." Little did she know that the day of change was closer than she ever imagined, and that Destiny, her son, was about to lead her back to the past she thought she had lost forever. The city they had traveled to was far less forgiving than Debora had imagined. It was a place where dreams were either made or crushed in an instant, and for the poor, survival was a daily battle. For months, Debora and Destiny wandered its streets, looking for shelter, food, and work. They ended up under a bridge, joining other forgotten souls who had been discarded by life. Nights were the hardest. The cold bit into their bones, and the sound of traffic above their heads reminded them of a world moving forward without them. Yet, even in those dark times, Destiny's spirit never broke. He was a boy of resilience, just like his mother. By day, he worked odd jobs, cleaning cars, carrying loads, selling scraps, anything that could bring them a little money. By night, he would sit with Debora, asking her to tell him stories about her youth, about his grandmother, and about the father he never knew. Each time he asked about his father, Debora's heart ached. She wanted to tell him everything, but fear kept her silent. She feared his anger, his disappointment, his questions. So, she would smile faintly and say, "One day, you will know everything." Destiny, though unsatisfied, trusted her. He had no idea that the answer he longed for was closer than he thought. One fateful day, Debora's health began to fail. She had ignored the coughs, the headaches, and the exhaustion for weeks, but now her body was too weak to carry her through. She collapsed under the bridge, her face pale and her breathing shallow. Destiny panicked. He could not lose her, not after everything they had been through. Desperation drove him to the streets, where he ran from stranger to stranger, begging for money to save his mother. People brushed him aside, unwilling to listen to the cries of a ragged boy. Just as hope was about to fade, he ran into a man, a driver dressed neatly in a suit. Destiny threw himself at the man's feet, pouring out his story with tears streaming down his face. The driver was moved. Though he was on an errand for his wealthy boss, he could not ignore the boy's plea. He took Destiny to the hospital, carrying Debora in his arms, and ensured she was admitted. Unknown to Destiny, this small act of mercy had just set in motion the chain of events that would rewrite his life forever. The driver, loyal to his duties, informed his boss about the delay. His boss, Mr. Bryan, was irritated at first. His schedule was tight, and he had little patience for distractions. But when the driver explained why he had been delayed, something shifted in Bryan. The story of a boy begging for his sick mother stirred something deep inside him, though he could not explain why. Perhaps it was because the story felt oddly familiar, like a whisper from the past he had buried. "Take care of them," Bryan ordered, handing money for hospital bills before rushing off to an emergency meeting. Days later, curiosity gnawed at him. He asked his driver about the boy and his mother, but by then, Debora had been discharged. Disappointed, he returned home, only to find the unthinkable waiting for him at his gate, Debora and Destiny, standing before him, their clothes worn, their faces weary, yet unmistakable. Time seemed to freeze. His eyes locked on hers, and in that moment, 16 years of silence crashed down on both of them. "Debora," he whispered, his voice trembling. She froze, tears streaming as she whispered back, "Bryan." Neither of them knew that the storm of truth was about to break open, and Destiny, caught between them, was about to learn the secret that would change his life forever. The moment Bryan stood face to face with Debora after so many years, time seemed to freeze. His heart pounded violently as if the walls of his chest were too fragile to hold it back. He whispered her name with disbelief, his voice cracking under the weight of emotions he had suppressed for over a decade. Debora's eyes were filled with tears, her body trembling as though the earth beneath her was collapsing. For 16 long years, she had hidden her pain, her struggles, and her greatest secret. But now, that secret was standing right beside her, looking up at both of them with innocent yet confused eyes. "Destiny." Bryan's hands trembled as he reached toward the boy, but hesitation stopped him midway. Could it really be true? Could this boy he just met be his blood, his son, the piece of his life he never knew was missing? His eyes shifted between Debora and Destiny, searching desperately for answers. Debora, overwhelmed, broke down in tears. Her lips trembled as she whispered the truth, that she had carried his child after leaving abruptly all those years ago. Destiny's wide eyes shifted in disbelief, unable to fully process the meaning of his mother's confession. His small voice cut through the tension like a blade, asking the question neither of them knew how to answer. "You mean, he is my father?" Bryan staggered back, collapsing into a nearby chair as the truth washed over him like a tidal wave. His life, once carefully controlled and privileged, had just been turned upside down. He remembered their days together as students, the late-night conversations, the promises of love, and how suddenly Debora had vanished. For years, he had questioned himself, blaming his busy schedule, his family's interference, and even fate for losing her. But never had he imagined that her disappearance was because she was carrying his child. The revelation tore him apart, regret clawed at him mercilessly, whispering what could have been if only he had searched harder, if only he had refused to let her slip away. Debora knelt before him, sobbing as she tried to explain her struggles, her mother's death, her poverty, her inability to contact him, and how life had cornered her into silence. She told him of the nights she cried alone, the shame she bore, the weight of raising a child in hardship. Bryan listened, his own tears falling uncontrollably, but a storm of emotions raged within him: love for Debora, guilt for failing her, shame for never searching harder, and an overwhelming joy that Destiny was his son. Destiny, still in shock, stood frozen, watching his mother and the man who was suddenly his father crumble under the weight of truth. But just as emotions began to settle, reality came crashing back in. Bryan's life was not his alone. He was a senator's son, a man born into wealth and responsibility. He had a family that controlled his choices and a society that scrutinized his every move. His family, especially his father, would never accept this sudden revelation, a woman from a poor background reappearing with a teenage son claiming to be their heir. The tension in the room grew heavier with every passing second. Brian reached out to touch Destiny, and for the first time, the boy allowed himself to be embraced, his small arms wrapping around his father's trembling frame. But in that embrace, Brian knew the battle had just begun. This was no simple reunion. It was a storm waiting to erupt, a war between love and status, between truth and pride. And as Debora wept silently, Brian whispered in his son's ear, promising that no matter what happened, he would never abandon him again. But deep inside, Brian feared the storm that awaited them all, because the truth was powerful, but in a world ruled by power, truth alone was never enough. The news of Brian's secret family did not stay hidden for long. His father, Senator Williams, soon caught wind of whispers about Brian's mysterious connection to a woman from his past and a teenage boy. The senator was a man of immense influence, a figure feared and respected in equal measure, and he valued nothing above the family's reputation. The night Brian decided to introduce Debora and Destiny to his household was a night filled with tension so thick it could suffocate. As the gates of the senator's mansion opened and Debora stepped inside with her son, Destiny clutched tightly to her hand, unsure of what awaited them. Brian walked beside them, his face pale but determined, knowing full well he was about to defy everything his family stood for. The senator, seated regally in the living room, wasted no time with pleasantries. His sharp eyes assessed Debora like she was an intruder, a threat, and when his gaze landed on Destiny, he scowled. "Who are these people?" he demanded, his voice laced with venom. Brian took a deep breath and introduced them, his love from the past, the woman who had endured so much, and the son he had unknowingly fathered. The silence that followed was deafening, until the senator exploded with rage, calling it an insult, a disgrace, an attempt to tarnish their family name. Debora stood there, her knees trembling, but she held her ground. She had endured poverty, pain, and humiliation. This confrontation was just another storm she had to weather. Destiny, however, felt the sting of rejection deep in his young heart. He had imagined meeting his father's family as something joyous, something out of a dream where they would embrace him and welcome him home. Instead, he stood in the cold shadows of disdain, watching a man who shared his blood deny his existence. Tears welled in his eyes, but he bit his lip, refusing to let them fall. Brian, on the other hand, could no longer contain himself. He stood before his father, trembling with both fear and anger, and declared that nothing, no status, not wealth, not even the senator's power, would make him turn his back on his son or the woman he loved. The senator, enraged, gave him an ultimatum: abandon Debora and Destiny, or lose his inheritance, his influence, and the family name. The words cut deep, but Brian had already made his choice the moment he saw Debora again. He turned to his father and declared that he chose love, he chose family, and he chose truth over lies. The senator's face darkened, his fury palpable, but Brian did not waver. He knew the road ahead would be painful, but for the first time in years, he felt alive, free, and truly himself. That night, Brian, Debora, and Destiny left the mansion together, hand in hand, not knowing what awaited them. Outside those gilded gates, the world looked at them differently. Society whispered, the media began to circle, and enemies waited to exploit their vulnerability. But within their little circle of three, there was a new strength, a new hope. For Debora, it was a vindication of her struggles, proof that love had indeed found its way back to her. For Destiny, it was the beginning of a new life where he finally knew who he was and where he belonged. And for Brian, it was redemption, a chance to right the wrongs of the past, no matter the cost. The new battles awaited them, the wrath of the senator, the cruelty of a society that valued wealth over truth, and the harsh realities of building a new life outside the walls of privilege. But as they walked into the night, the bond they shared was stronger than any storm. Destiny looked up at his father with hopeful eyes, and Brian squeezed his hand gently, silently promising to fight for him until his last breath. And though the war between love and power was far from over, one thing was certain: love had found its way back, and this time, it wasn't letting go. Thank you for watching. Subscribe for more.